Let me take off a layer because I won't be talking quick. And I'm going to generate heat. So, chapter 13 is all about the central nervous system. The central nervous system might seem pretty easy. It's just your brain and your spinal cord, but it gets a lot more in-depth than that. A lot of this stuff we will... Nobody was asking you, Siri. A lot of this stuff we will look at again in lab. I'm going to do a brain dissection. I'm going to watch, you guys are just going to watch me do it. Probably the day after or the day of your muscles exam. We'll probably do that in the morning. And then I'll do a brain dissection after that. We'll just take some notes. I'll show you guys some stuff. It'll be fun. You also have may or may not have a dissection final. We'll see how close we get to doing that. And by dissection final, I just mean identifying some specific things in the brain or in a heart or in the animal itself. Okay, but that's coming down later. Don't think about that right now. So the central nervous system comprises the brain and spinal cord, and when we talk about it in some specific directional terms. Okay. Rostral just means that it is moving towards the nose. And caudal means that it's moving towards the tail. If you've heard of the cauda equina, that's at the very bottom of your spine. That's just kind of a bunch of fillers and spinal nerves that kind of hang out at the bottom. Okay? So rostral is kind of coming out towards your nose, caudal going down towards your tail. The brain is a super complex system, and it controls things like heart rate, respiratory rate, blood pressure, your autonomic nervous system, which handles all of your automatic things that you don't even really think about, your endocrine system, and it's involved in innervation of the head through cranial nerves. We talked about a lot of them, about 10, well, all of them hang out in there, but 10 of those cranial nerves hang out on the cerebellum, or on the brainstem. Okay? Don't worry, we'll talk about that a lot more. The brain controls some of the most complex neural functions that you have, that being having intelligence, being intelligence. The fact that you guys are all in here today means that you have a brain and it does do some complex neural functions. So good job to you. Okay? It controls your consciousness, your memory, your sensory and motor integration, your emotions, your behavior, and your ability to socialize. Embryonically, your brain arises from the rostral part of the neural tube, so the towards the nose part starts up there. And when we talk about the brain, we talk about it in kind of parts, especially embryonically, in all parts actually. In that first bit of development, after you've kind of developed that neural tube, we develop what we call the primary brain vesicles. Okay, you can kind of think of it like that, kind of like a large poop. The first part is the proencephalon, and that forms your forebrain. The mesencephalon forms the midbrain, and the rhombencephalon forms the hindbrain. Okay. It wouldn't be anatomy unless these primary brain vesicles broke up into more pieces. So right around week 5, 6 or so, your proencephalon and rhombencephalon break up into more parts. Okay, so the proencephalon will divide into the telencephalon and the diencephalon. Luckily, the mesencephalon does not divide at all, so it stays just as it is, the mesencephalon. And then the rhomboencephalon, I'm losing the ability to say the word cephalon, but you get what I'm trying to say there, divides into the metaencephalon, spelled it wrong, sorry, metencephalon, and the myelencephalon. Y'all got that? Myelencephalon? Okay, cool. And just when you thought it stopped there, it does not. These secondary brain vesicles will then develop into the structures of your adult brain. Okay. Your telencephalon will develop into your cerebral hemispheres. So that's like the big bit of brain that you think of when you think of your brain. The diencephalon is kind of that inner core of your brain, and it is composed of the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. The metencephalon forms the pons and cerebellum, and then the myencephalon forms the medulla oblongata. Okay, pons, medulla oblongata, and the midbrain that was formed by that mesencephalon will all form up your brainstem. Okay. Cool? Okay. So, like I said, your brainstem includes the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. You get these from the whatever encephalon that it was. Metenceph. And this one is myelenceph. Okay. And then the ventricles. Ventricles are those like enlarged neural tube cavities. So remember, your brain started as just a tube. That tube doesn't actually go anywhere. It just forms into these twists and turns that allow for fluid to pass through. That fluid is cerebral spinal fluid, or CSF. Okay. So, right, we start from the tube, we get our primary brain vesicles, our secondary brain vesicles, and then eventually we will form our adult brain structures. And those adult brain structures all have those central cavity fluid tubes in them. Right? So as you are developing as an embryo, the brain is one of the fastest growing things. The changes occur really quickly, and we get a bunch of wrinkling of the cerebral hemispheres, and that increases the surface area, making it so that more neurons will fit within that limited space of your brain. Okay. That's what it looks like when you're a baby. It starts as this tube. You get your primary kind of flexures. Those flexures will start to kind of form. Eventually, your cerebral hemisphere will start to form around your diencephalon, and that's what kind of makes up your brain. Cool. So when we talk about the brain, we kind of classify it into four main regions. I talked about the midbrain pons medulla. What is that region again? That's your brainstem. Great. The other parts of it are the cerebellum, the diencephalon, and the cerebrum. do at that time. And your cerebrum is composed of those two hemispheres, right and left brain. We're going to talk about all four of these in great detail. That's pretty much what this whole chapter is about. Okay? So the ventricles of the brain, remember I kind of talked about those. That's the tube that became those windy, twisty turnies of fluid inside of your head. Okay? They are expansions of that brain's central cavity. And that's basically just the tube filled with fluid. The fluid that they are filled with is cerebrospinal fluid. Your ventricles are lined with what we call ependymal cells. Remember, we talked about those. These are a neuroglial cell, meaning it is a supporting cell of your nervous system. Okay? All of your ventricles are continuous with each other. As well as with the central canal of the spinal cord. So all of the fluid that runs from your spinal cord into your brain is the same fluid. Okay? It's all one big liquid system. Okay? So when we talk about the ventricles, these are what they look like. I just wanted to give you guys a little bit of a visual before I kind of start talking about them. These guys here, these horn-like guys, these are your lateral ventricles. Also, they used to be referred to as your first and second ventricle. We don't call them that anymore. Now they're just your lateral ventricles. Okay? You've got your third ventricle right in through here. This is your third ventricle. Okay? Your fourth ventricle is just behind that, kind of near the cerebellum. And then that connects into your spinal cord. Okay. Stop. Okay. All right. So your lateral ventricles, those are located in your cerebral hemispheres. That's not how you spell hemisphere. Hemisphere. And they are separated by the, what's it called? Septum pellucidum. Septum pellucidum is just this very thin sheath of tissue in between those two ventricles. Okay? They connect to the third ventricle. Let's actually do that this way. They connect to the third ventricle via the interventricular, I don't need to write it, it's right here, by the interventricular foramen, between ventricles foramen. Your third ventricle hangs out in the diencephalon. That's one of those major parts of the brain. And that third ventricle is connected to the fourth ventricle via this cerebral aqueduct. Connects third to fourth. Your fourth ventricle is in the hindbrain, so it's in that kind of back part of the brain around where your cerebellum and brainstem. And then that fourth ventricle is continuous with the spinal cord. So your spinal cord just kind of comes out right after that. Okay. So that's ventricles. Now we're going to talk about kind of how gray matter and white matter is distributed throughout the brain. Remember that gray matter is mostly just like neuronal cell bodies, some pretty short non-myelinated axons, stuff like that. And then white matter is going to be your longer myelinated axons that kind of transmit information. All right? Your brain has some gray matter. I'm going to interchange Gray and Grey. They're the same gray, okay? I grew up with British-speaking people. You know what I mean. The Brits, okay? And they contain cell bodies. Okay. So that's the very, very inside of the brain. The next layer has some white matter, and that contains mostly axons. Okay. Let's do that. Okay. And then there's another layer of gray matter outside of that white matter. And that's what we call the cortex, that outer layer of gray matter. And it's formed of neuronal cell bodies, and you're going to find that both in the cerebrum and the cerebellum. So you have deep internal gray matter, some white matter outside of that, and then more gray matter around that. Okay? That's kind of what I was talking about there. You see that gray matter of the cortex on the outside, white matter near the inside, and then gray matter towards the middle. We call that internal gray matter brain nuclei. Not to be confused with cell nuclei, but brain nuclei. Okay. We okay so far? Great. Here's where it really picks up. So, brainstem. What does it include? I've talked about it a couple of times now. Give me something. Pons, medulla oblongata, and the midbrain. Oblongata and the midbrain. Okay? Has lots of different functions. It is the passageway for all of the fiber tracts that run between the cerebrum and the spinal cord. Okay? All of those fiber tracts. So all of the moving that you need to do in a day, that's going from your motor cortex all the way to the spinal nerves that enact all of that motion. So all of that passes through your brainstem. Okay? It is heavily involved in the innervation of the head and face. And 12 of the 10 of the 12 pairs of cranial nerves attach directly to your brainstem. Thankfully, your brainstem also produces, not in yellow, please, all of the automatic and autonomic behaviors that you need to survive. Survival. and is really, really good at integrating your auditory and visual reflexes. What would an example of an auditory reflex be? If someone behind you made a really loud noise, your head would kind of automatically turn to see what was going on, right? That's an auditory reflex. So if we're looking at a brain, we flipped it upside down. This is your spinal cord. This little bit here is your medulla oblongata. This kind of bit part in here is your pons, and then your midbrain sits just above that, but it's deeper inside the actual brain. So it's a little bit harder to see, but I promise you it's in there. Okay? All right. So the medulla oblongata is the most caudal part of the brainstem. By caudal, it just means close to tail. So that part is continuous with your spinal cord, right? Part of the fourth ventricle lies on the back side of the top half of the medulla oblongata. So you would find that right around, it's on the back, but say this was dorsal and I switched around, it would kind of be right up here. A little bit of that fourth ventricle. Right? Your medulla oblongata has some white matter fiber tracts that connect with the rostral, or more top towards the nose part of your brain. You can kind of see, I can't zoom that in. You can kind of see these like ridges on that piece there. See those ridges I was talking about right in here? These are called pyramidal tracts. We'll come back to that. Okay. When we talk about the medulla oblongata, we talk about these fiber tracts and the nuclei that are associated with it. So the major fiber tracts, those are going to be the pyramids of the medulla. Remember those little ridges that I kind of just talked about on the ventral side of that surface. Those pyramidal tracts do something that we call decussation. Yeah. And that is just the process of those tracks crossing over. And that allows, and that's what pretty much makes, I'm sure that you guys have heard that the right side of your body controls the left side of your brain controls the right side of your body, and vice versa. It's that desiccation that causes that. Okay. The inferior cerebral peduncles, these are some white matter tracts that connect the medulla to the cerebellum. And we'll find out why that's important later. And then the olive of the medulla, this is a gray matter nucleus that acts sort of as a relay station. And we'll talk about that inferior olivary nucleus in just a bit. Okay. So, if I sliced up that guy, I would have my pyramids on that ventral surface. We'll talk about the reticular formation and what that means for your lives later. These dots in here, these are different nuclei. This one is that inferior olivary nucleus, which is a relay station. And again, we'll talk about that. Okay. So 4 pairs of cranial nerves that attach specifically to the medulla oblongata. First, we have cranial nerve 8. Which one's that? Vestibulocochlear. 9. Glossopharyngeal. 10. Vagus. What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. And then 12. Hypoglossal nerve. These 4 cranial nerves attach directly to the medulla oblongata. They will synapse onto some specific nuclei in the brain. Okay? For the vestibular cochlear, it will go to the vestibular nuclei and the cochlear nuclei. These are both sensory nuclei. So they receive sensory information. Okay? Glossopharyngeal, that one's going to go to, let's do that in same red. That one's going to go to the nucleus ambiguous, ambiguous, and the solitary nucleus. All right. Nucleus ambiguous is a motor nuclei, and the solitary nucleus is a sensory nuclei. The vagus nerve will synapse onto the dorsal motor nucleus. The solitary nucleus, and the nucleus ambiguous. Nucleus ambiguous. Okay, and that's motor, and sensory. Okay. And then the hypoglossal nerve will synapse near the hypoglossal nucleus, which is under motor control. You will find that your cranial nerves some of them will have sensory nerve fibers, some of them will have motor nerve fibers, and some will have both. Okay? That's not quite right. My brother says. Ah, there it is. Sorry. Wait. Right? Okay. This indicates motor, both sensory as we go. Okay. The mnemonic for that is another one that is a little risque. Ah, that's what it is. And I was wrong anyway. So all that stuff that you just wrote, erase it. Because it's some say. Some say money matters, but my brother says big boobs matter more. Okay? Some say money matters, but my brother says big boobs matter more. Okay? Sensory, sensory, motor, motor, both, sensory, both, motor, motor. Okay? And that's true, right? Glossopharyngeal, you have some that articulate onto a motor synapse, some that articulate onto a sensory synapse. So far, so well. Okay? Don't get me fired, please. It's just a mnemonic. I did not make it up. Okay? So here we are just looking at the brainstem. Again, we kind of see our cranial nerves that have attached to our brainstem there. They do so in pairs. Medulla, pons, and midbrain. Okay. Same thing, different image. The core of the medulla oblongata contains what we call the reticular formation. The reticular formation is super important in things such as arousal, like making sure that you wake up from sleep. As well as a bunch of other things that the reticular formation does. And its nuclei influence a lot of the autonomic functions, such as your cardiac center, your vasomotor center, your medullary respiratory center, and the centers for hiccuping, coughing, sneezing, swallowing, etc. Sneeze, swallow, etc. Okay. Your cardiac center controls the force and rate of your heartbeat. The vasomotor center regulates blood pressure, via constricting and dilating or blood vessels. Medullary respiratory center is what controls the rhythm and rate of your breathing. Okay. There it is again. You know it. You love it. It's your brainstem. Okay? So, I talked very briefly about that inferior olivary nucleus. Your inferior olivary nucleus is a relay station for sensory information going to your cerebellum. Okay. It sends specifically proprioceptive information up from the spinal cord. Relay nuclei, we're going to talk about relay nuclei. There's a lot of them throughout your body and your brain, and they process and edit the information before sending it off to somewhere else. Okay. Some other important nuclei that you need to know in the medulla are the nucleus gracilis and nucleus cutaneus. I don't see these on here, but we'll talk about those maybe when we get there. Maybe not. It might be on your study guide. I'll let you know. Okay? All right, so your pons, we've now moved up from the medulla into the pons. That's this guy right here. And it is what we call a bridge between the midbrain and the medulla oblongata. Right? It contains what we call pontine nuclei. And those pontine nuclei are relay nuclei that connect part of the cerebral cortex to the cerebellum. Let's actually put that over here. Yeah, pontine nuclei relay from relay and connect info from the cerebral cortex to the cerebellum. Cranial nerves 5, 6, and 7 attach here. And that's your trigeminal nerve, your abducens nerve, and your facial nerve. Okay. And then we'll relay onto the trigeminal nuclei. There's actually 4 of them. I'm not going to list them. The abducens nucleus, and the facial nucleus. And there are several of those as well. Nuclei. I think there's like 5 of them. Okay. The pons has some motor tracts. Coming in from the cerebral cortex, and those tracts will synapse onto those pontine nuclei, like I said. And then those pontine nuclei will take that information, process it, and send it off to the cerebellum. And it will do so through the middle cerebral peduncles. sorry, not cerebral, middle cerebellar peduncles. You have a superior, middle, and inferior peduncle, and they all connect a different part of the brain stem to the cerebellum. Okay. These are those pontine nuclei I was talking about. That reticular formation actually runs all the way up through your brainstem, so you're going to see it in all phases of it, but the majority of it's going to hang out in the medulla oblongata. All right, the midbrain is in between the diencephalon and the pons. Okay. The cerebral aqueduct is the central cavity, so it's just the continuous tube part of the midbrain. The cerebral peduncles are on the ventral surface of the brain. Ventral surface of the brain, and they contain those pyramidal tracts that I've been talking about. Those tracts go from the cerebral cortex down to your brainstem. And then, like I said, those different cerebral peduncles will connect different areas of the brain stem to the cerebellum. In this case, the superior cerebellar peduncles connect the midbrain to the cerebellum. So the middle cerebellar peduncle connects the pons to cerebellum, and the inferior cerebellar connects the medulla to cerebellum. Okay. Same thing, different view. We've seen that a couple times. All right, so some specific structures in the midbrain that you're going to need to know. One of them is the periaqueductal gray matter. And that periaqueductal gray matter surrounds the cerebral aqueduct. Remember, that cerebral aqueduct is that little passageway between the fourth ventricle and the spinal cord. I don't think that's right. The third ventricle and the fourth ventricle. Yeah, between the third and fourth ventricle. Okay. So it plays a role. It has some nuclei in here that plays a role in two pretty related functions: fight or flight, as well as mediating your response to visceral pain. Visceral pain is pain from like your internal organs. Okay. It has some cell bodies of cranial nerves 3 and 4. Okay. It acts as your midbrain's link to your perception of fear. And then those autonomic physical reactions when you are afraid. Like when you get scared, your heart rate elevates. You start breathing a little faster or harder or something like that, so that you can get prepared to run away from whatever the danger is. Okay. And then your corpora quadrigemini is a group of 4 nuclei. Okay. And they are what make up kind of the top part of your midbrain. Whatever. Okay. We divide them into superior and inferior colliculi, and they are used, these corpora quadrigemini, their job is to integrate audio and visual reflexes. Okay. A visual reflex would be like if I threw a pen or something across the room, your eyes would kind of naturally track it without even you being conscious of you tracking that movement. Okay. Audio reflex, I kind of talked about that. If someone were to make a loud noise, you would kind of turn your head to find out where that sound was coming from. Okay. The superior colliculi, are the nuclei that act in your visual reflexes, and the inferior colliculi respond to your auditory reflexes. Okay, cool. Cool. There it is again, your brainstem. How many times have you seen it? So what part is this part? This part. Yeah, that's your medulla. And then you can't really see it because this is the back of it, but your pons is right here. And then your midbrain is hanging out right up here. Okay. So we have some important nuclei in the midbrain that we also talk about, some more important nuclei. And these ones happen to be embedded in the white matter of the midbrain. That does not mean that they are white matter, but they are hanging out in there. They are pretty pigmented, okay? The first is called the substantia nigra. Substantia nigra. And it is darker in color because it contains pigments of melanin. Functionally, it is linked to the basal nuclei, and those basal nuclei are deep in the cerebrum. Okay. This one is involved in, actually I'm not going to do red, I'm going to do green because the next one, this one is linked to controlling voluntary movements. You're going to find there's a lot of stuff that is linked to voluntary movement. Okay. And then we find degradation of this nuclei is what causes Parkinson's disease. Parkinson's disease is an autoimmune disease in which people cannot control body movements. They tend to have things like tremors. They tend to have things like, there's no other word for tremors. Tremors. They cannot control their bodily movements, so they do quite a bit of shaking. Okay. The other nucleus is the red nucleus. It's a pretty big guy, and it's the largest nucleus in the reticular formation. Okay, remember I talked about that reticular formation, helps with arousal from sleep and all that kinds of stuff. Okay. It is red because it has a high blood supply and lots of iron. And functionally, it is closely associated with the cerebrum. I can't spell and talk. Association with cerebrum. And has a minor role in like limb flexing. Just a little bit. Not its main job. So cool. That's your brainstem. That was one of the parts of the brain that we talk about. Remember, there are 4. And all of them get broken up into further and further and further divisions. It wouldn't be anatomy if it didn't. Okay, cool. So moving on to number 2 here. We got the cerebellum. The cerebellum is dorsal to the pons and medulla, meaning that it is kind of behind it. So if your brainstem is here, your cerebellum is kind of back here. Its function is to smooth and coordinate body movements. I'm going to erase that. As well as helping to maintain equilibrium. Okay. It consists of 2 cerebellar hemispheres. Not to be confused with your cerebral hemispheres. Hear me when I say that. Do not confuse your cerebellar hemispheres with your cerebral hemispheres. They are different. Okay. These surfaces are folded into ridges called folia, very similar to the gyri of your cerebral hemisphere. And these fissures are very similar to the sulcus. Sulcuses. I'm going to go sulcuses. Okay. And then each hemisphere is divided into 3 lobes. And those lobes are the anterior, posterior, and flocculondular. Flocculondular. That's what I'm going to go with. Okay. The anterior and posterior lobes, their main thing is going to be coordinating limb and trunk movement. And then your flocculondular lobe is going to be what adjusts your posture to maintain equilibrium and coordinating your head and eye movements. Coordinate. Just posture. Cord. I'm just going to put cord there. Head and eye movement. Flocculondular. Waka flocka blank. Okay. So your cerebellum is composed of 3 regions, just like everything else. Not everything else, but at least your cerebrum. It has a deep gray matter, some white matter around that, and then some gray matter around that as well. Okay. The cortex is that outer gray matter. The arbor vitae is the internal white matter, and then the deep cerebellar nuclei are what we call that deeply situated dark matter or gray matter. So that, then that, then that. That makes sense when I draw it like that? As much as it can make sense. I know this is a lot of information. We're not even halfway through. We are halfway through this presentation, but the next one is 80 slides, okay? That's kind of what it looks like. So you have that gray matter core. Arbor vitae straight up means tree of life. And that makes sense because it looks like a tree, okay? And then you have some deep nuclei hanging out in there, okay? We talked about them when we were talking about the brainstem, but the cerebellum has those cerebellar peduncles, okay? Your superior cerebellar peduncles connect the midbrain to the cerebellum. The middle ones connect the pons, and the inferior connects the medulla oblongata. Okay. And the fibers that come to and from the cerebellum are ipsilateral, meaning that they are from the same side. Okay. They are same side, same side. Your superior is going to get mostly motor functions. Your middle is going to get mainly sensory. From specifically your cerebral cortex and the pontine nuclei. And then your inferior are mainly going to get sensory fibers from your vestibular nucleus and your spinal cord. And that last one's going to help you with proprioception and equilibrium. Okay. So you got your anterior lobe, you got your posterior lobe, and then your teeny tiny flocculongular lobe. Okay. Since the cerebellum's job is to coordinate body movements, the cerebellar cortex receives 3 different types of information. Okay. The first type of information is going to be info on equilibrium. Remember, it's going to get that from those vestibular nuclei. It's going to get information on the current movements of the limbs, trunk, and neck. Heck, that looks like heck, don't it? Okay. And then it will also receive information from the cerebral cortex. I have to stop doing that. That's going to piss me off. Okay. How does it coordinate those movements? It coordinates those movements by the cerebellum receiving that information on movement from the cerebrum. You're good. About planned movements. What are planned movements? Your voluntary movement. Okay? And they get this info from the motor cortex. Motor cortex. Okay? The cerebellum will then compare how the body is actually positioned with how it wants to be moved. And then the cerebellum will send back instructions to the cerebral cortex about how to adjust to get the planned movement that we want. Give you guys a spicy second to write that one down. So it'll go something a little bit like this, right? Your motor cortex will say, hey, I want to move. I need to do that, okay? That information will travel down those pyramid tracks to the pontine nuclei, okay? The pontine nuclei will send that info to the lateral part of the anterior and posterior cerebellar lobes. Cerebellar lobes. Okay. At the same time, information from, for example, your vestibular nucleus, right? Because remember, that's equilibrium information, so that's relayed info, is going to send that information to the gloccolocco lobe, gloccolondular. Okay. From there, your cerebellum will say, hey, I know what you need to do with this in order to get your arms to wave them like you just don't care, right? In order to do that, I will send you, the cerebrum, some refined information on how to adjust the rest of our body to make sure that this happens, okay? And then from the cerebrum will be like, okay, cool, got you, now I know what to do, and then it will send that info down the spinal cord so that your spinal nerves can activate all of the muscles that do all of that stuff. And all of this happens so quickly, because if you think about it, even every time you're moving your pencil, your brain is constantly thinking about, how do I move to make this letter? How do I move to do X, Y, or Z, right? So all of this is happening so fast, okay? Your cerebellum also has a few higher cognitive functions, one of them being learning a new motor skill, right? So if you know how to play an instrument and you've memorized how to play that instrument forever, right? That muscle memory is sitting in your brain. That's part of that higher functioning of the cerebellum. Also participates in cognition via the process of language, a little bit of problem solving, and some task planning. Cool.